Connor, it's all yours.
Okay, for group one.
All right. So for Group Orange, we're talking about Book 5 and the funerary rituals that took place when Aeneas was honoring the death of his father, the one-year anniversary. And so we're considering other funerary rituals that took place in other texts that we've read. So for me, I focused on Gilgamesh and the Aeneid, and in Gilgamesh when Enkidu dies and Gilgamesh is kind of lamenting and trying to honor the death. So in both texts there's kind of this dedication to honoring his memory and then making sure that everyone remembers him, not just like within your own heart. So in the beginning, lines of Book 5, lines 77 through 78, let's see if I can find it. Aeneas is asking everyone to mourn the death of his father. He says, "Come then, everyone will celebrate this holiday in joy." So it's not just segregated to people that knew his father. He wants everyone to know the memory of his father. And then in Gilgamesh, tablet 8, lines 9 through 41, he is again asking everyone to remember the death. He says, "May the elders, may the crowd, may the high peaks, may the pastures," and he goes on for many lines, listing everyone that will mourn him and everyone that will remember him, even if they didn't know who Enkidu was. And then there's also the need to do like physical honorings and do rituals. So in Gilgamesh, he creates a statue made of Enkidu, which is tablet 8, lines 67 through 69. And then he also says he's going to put him on a bed and honor him and kiss his feet in tablet 8, lines 84 through 87. And then in a similar way, Aeneas holds rituals in order to honor his father, but he does it instead through offerings that he vows to do each year, which is lines 81 through 83. So in both texts, we can see the need to do physical acts in order to honor and to remember the death of Enkidu and Aeneas' father.
Very cool. I compared Enkidu's death to Moses. And something I noticed was that just how both Enkidu and Moses died before they could reach their promised land. I thought that was kind of interesting. But for Moses' case, after he died, this is in Deuteronomy 34, passage 8. The Israelites grieved for Moses in the plains of Moab for 30 days until the time of weeping and mourning was over, and then they kept moving. It's like I noticed in Book 5 was the line 62 through 64. Like he said, the months are spent, the rounding year fulfilled, and being interred my God like father's bones, and mourned it and blessed his altars. And then later, basically as Louise said, then they started the rituals and the games and stuff. So I noticed that with the Hebrews, they mourn for a month, then they keep going, but for the Trojans here, they mourn for a little bit longer, and then they have a big festival at the end of it. The mourning period.
Something that I noticed in terms of comparing it to the Greeks, how the Greeks treated and viewed death is that in the Iliad actually, when Patroclus dies, his death is commemorated with a funeral and athletic games, which is really similar to what we saw. Meanwhile they're treating Hector's body really terribly, they're dragging it around and just abusing it until eventually the gods say he needs to get a proper burial. So essentially it seemed like they treat death as sort of it's really really relevant, what happens to you, what happens to your body after you die. And in the Aeneid, we see that you can't even go to the underworld unless you've received this proper burial that's so important. Because the priestess says he may not take them until their bones rest in the grave, so they can't even cross the river to get to the underworld until after they've been treated how they're supposed to be. And also in the Odyssey, Odysseus orders that his disloyal servants be killed with a sword, but Telemachus decides to hang them instead because it's more disgraceful. So even like how you die is seen as relevant to sort of like how peaceful you're going to be in the afterlife. And something else that I thought was interesting is that the Babylonians seem to focus more on like mourning than celebration, because Gilgamesh wants everybody to be like mourning for him, and he like cuts his hair and removes his like nice clothes as like a sign of mourning. Whereas Odysseus is like says we'll celebrate this holiday and joy, so he sees it as like we need to like keep this connection and celebrate their life rather than mourn their death. And also interesting like possible cause of that is that they seem to have like a much closer like connection with their dead, because even in the Aeneid he literally goes to see his father after he's died and sees that he's in this like nice place, or at least that it's not bad. So there seems to be sort of idea that the death isn't something to be like truly like feared, whereas Gilgamesh takes it as like it's terrifying. So.
Yeah, going off of the Gilgamesh versus Trojans, I had a point about there's the language that they use in terms of their dead is like in the Odyssey. There's the whole trip to the underworld and seeing ghosts. Wow, great. Thank you. In the Iliad or in the Aeneid, they do the same thing, and they see ghosts, of course, in the Iliad. But so in like this Greek text, and even in the Hebrew Bible, in 1 Samuel 28, Saul sees Samuel's ghost, and there's mentions in like the first two verses of that chapter that he's banned all contact with spirits. So it's like a common, or not common, but it's a language that they've used before. Versus Gilgamesh, not that it's not spiritual at all, but there's the pattern of repeating the turn to clay image in Tablet 7, that he's very scared that he's going to turn to clay like Enkidu did, which is more final and more, like Eliza said, scary, versus like we all have souls and we're all going to go to this afterlife place. And also in the Descent of Inanna, they say like no one ascends from the underworld, someone must take her place, even though she's a god, and so mortals just definitely can't. But here in the Aeneid, they have a long list of people who have gone to the underworld and at least tried to come back up. And then I also had a point about the importance of grave sites, which we've kind of touched on already. Elpenor in the Odyssey is one of the ghosts they see, and his like one thing is he wants to be buried properly so that he can cross the river. And Chryses' grave has in book 5, lines 992 and 993, has a hollowed grave or grove with an attendant priest, and then they have the funeral games of a year after his death. And then in Trojan Women, and they mention it in the Aeneid too, the sacrifice of Priam's daughter Polyxena at Achilles' grave. So like the grave site itself is very important.
Very good. Okay, so move on to group grade. Should I start off? Okay, so we have to find like the differences between the visits to the.
You got one? Excellent.
The visits to the Oracle of Apollo, or like compare it to the visit by Aeneas to the Oracle of Apollo. And one of the major ones I saw was the fact that the Oracle in Aeneid was a lot more straightforward with her. Her like oracles,
Mm-hmm.
and like she says, like, you sir now quit at last to cease danger, for whom still greater are in store to let at land. The Dardan race will reach Lavinian country, which is very simple to understand when you compare it to what the oracle says in Herodotus. His histories. It says, wait till the time shall come when a mole is a monarch of Medea, then you delicately and away to the pebbles of Hermes at book 1, page 23. So like, which Croesus was very confused by this, obviously, because it's very vague and uses a lot of metaphors. And even one of the similarities I saw between the visits was they both kind of told their the Croesus and Aeneas.
Croesus.
Aeneas, I forgot. Croesus and Aeneas.
Croesus. Okay. Everybody say Croesus.
Croesus.
Okay, very good. Okay.
Croesus and Aeneas. And they said they're gonna need some help, like in Aeneid it says begging so many tribes for aid, a bride formed to Tyrians. I cannot pronounce it. A marriage made with a stranger, and then like Croesus
Mhm.
was also told that he should find alliances with the other powerful Greeks.
One difference I saw in like Herodotus' histories and the Aeneid is that the attitude like the Virgin Bears showed to the temple of Apollo, like in book 7 in Herodotus, they went to Delphi and then like destroyed the temple of Apollo, like disrespecting the sacred ground. But here in like book 6 of the Aeneid, from line 12 to line 50, you can see that Aeneas and the rest of the Trojans, they respect the sacred ground, like kind of like admiring the work of Daedalus, admiring the door and the roofs, and really respecting the gods.
Unfortunately, I don't have a Herodotus Histories book, but from what I recall, in both instances, the oracle foretold of a great war. For Croesus, unfortunately, he misinterpreted what the oracle said. I believe she said something about a great empire falling. He interpreted that as the enemy that he was facing, when in reality it was his own empire that would fall. And in the Aeneid, again, the oracle says, book 6, 105, you escape the perils of the sea, but perils more grave await you on land. The Dardanians will enter Lavinium. Be sure of that, but we'll wish they had never come. War, I see horrible war in the Tiber foaming with blood. So it's predictions of death and war in both instances.
My example kind of goes along the same lines of predicting a fated war, but more so that in the Aeneid, in book 6, I believe in this book it's about 107 through 144. It seems like the oracle personifies Apollo a lot more than it is in Herodotus. It seems like, especially like Aeneas and the oracle going on like a journey together through Apollo's word. It just seemed like that Apollo was much more of a creature on earth than he was a god or somebody that wasn't present in their lives.
It's not a group cherry.
Oh, me? Okay. I compared to Drew Scipio. So, book 6 of the Aeneid, line 753, we see Aeneas is now in the underworld, and he's asking, what are the forms of evil here, O sister, tell me, and the punishments dealt out, why such lamentation? And then that no pure soul may cross the sill of evil. This realm is under Cretan Rhadamanthus. Iron rule. Rhadamanthus. Gotcha. Iron rule. He sentences. He listens, and makes the souls confess their crooked ways. How they put off atonements in the world with foolish satisfaction, thieves of time, until too late to the hour of death. And so we see kind of like a merit system of the afterlife, where if you have done poorly and you've acted unvirtuously, you will find yourself in very unfavorable conditions in the underworld. And in Dream of Scipio, that's also brought up, not to such detail as it is in the Aeneid, but on the last page, when, on the other hand, a man has failed to do this and has abandoned himself instead to bodily indulgence and becomes its slave, letting the passions which serve pleasure impel him to flout the laws both of gods and of men, his soul, after departing from his body, hovers about close to the earth, nor does it return to this place until many ages of torment have been undergone. It's not surprising that they share similar views. Both came from Roman writers. So we see the Romans view death not something final, but as a transition to something depending on how you acted within your life. If you act virtuously, it's depicted in Dream of Scipio that you're in a much better place, right? You go to the place where those who live have done the very best deeds, and they have served their country. And they'll find it easiest of all to soar upwards to this place. So, again, we have a merit system there.
Yeah, that I totally agree with the towns. What I'm going to compare the Aeneas Travels underworld to is the Epic of Gilgamesh. But as said in book 6, starting at around line 9-10, Aeneas travels through the underworld. He's going to have the help of the Golden Burrow, which allowed him to enter and pass through the river, where he saw Dido and all the dead soldiers and stuff. He revealed, he reached the gates to which it seemed like where he met his father, Anchises. And Anchises shows him the ancestors that are waiting to be born again, and the leaders that are to come after him. And he kind of like shows him like his destiny and stuff. So kind of here, it simulates like the ancestors, paying respect to the ancestors, so they kind of believe that once you die, you are waiting to be reborn again to the new world under your family again. So I guess it's kind of like a reincarnation, to where in the Epic of Gilgamesh, chapter 10, Gilgamesh is like, he just got this fear from death since he just seen that his friend Enkidu had died. So I guess like his understanding isn't as clear, so that's why he fears it and tries to search for the power of immortality. So it's kind of different here. So that's how I saw that, how it compared.
I compared Aeneas' travels with those of Odysseus and the Odyssey. The first thing I noticed was in the Odyssey, book 11, lines about 163 to 203. His mother is able to speak to him after she drinks the blood, and she tells him of his wife and his land in Telemachus. And then in Aeneid, book 6, lines 613 to 634, Aeneas is able to speak to Dido without her having to drink blood, but she kind of just glares at him and turns away without saying anything, and returns to Sicaeus, her dead husband, who it spoke about earlier in the books. And then also in the Aeneid, book 6, lines 684 through 716, Priam's son is also able to speak freely, and he tells them that even though Aeneas couldn't find him, he didn't do anything wrong. And then another thing was in the Odyssey, book 11, lines 568 through 571. Minos sits with his golden scepter and judgment upon the dead, and the ghosts wait for him to sentence them. But then in the Aeneid, book 6, lines 760 through 767, it's the same part that Towns was talking about, where he sits in judgment and he kind of puts all the souls on trial and makes them confess their sins, which was different than the Odyssey, because in the Odyssey, the ghosts just wait for him to sentence them, but in the Aeneid, they're forced to confess the sins that they.
Okay, so I tied it to many things. So I tied our passage in
Book 6 to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Descent of Inanna, and a little bit of the Iliad. And so for Epic of Gilgamesh, Descent of Inanna, and the Aeneid, they all use the trees and birds as symbols. In the Descent of Inanna, that was on page 75, and it's on page 166. In the Aeneid, on line 276. And then after that, in the Epic of Gilgamesh in Tablet 9, it shows a field of gems, and in my notes I wrote down that it shows that people's emotions can be quickly overridden by greed, even in the face of death, like if they're trying to overcome the grief from death. And so in the Aeneid, book 6, lines 296 through 298, it says that he greedily picked the gold branch, and so this was after they had to properly bury their friend, and so it said that he was like having to bury him grimly, and that he was weeping along with his people who were helping him. And then my next tie was to the Iliad, and so this was a difference because Achilles, he prepared, well, it was just about the preparation of the body sort of thing. And so in the Iliad, Achilles prepared Hector's body by himself. He didn't get any of his men to help him after he'd already messed up Hector's body and treated him so poorly. And Aeneas did not do this. He makes his men mostly deal with the body, and so it shows that he does not have the remorse as much so as Achilles did. And then in Tablet 8, going back to Gilgamesh, this is just as I went, so sorry my thought process is kind of all over the place. But in Tablet 8 of Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh he worries so much about giving Enkidu a very elaborate ceremony for his death because he wanted everyone to grieve for him. And it shows again how materialistic he was, and this again shows how materialistic that they still were in the Aeneid. So this is a value that's carried over, how greed can overcome any sense of grief no matter how hard it is. And then so kind of current day tie that I made up was that the boat with the souls and the going to see all of them on page 171 in this book. Let's look at the lines. So it talks about the souls and the dead black water on lines 432 through 434. And so the tie that I made is that this is very similar to a scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where they're going to Davy Jones's locker, but they're upside down, and so then she sees her dad, and she's like, "Oh, Dad, why are you here?" And then, Dad's dead, so he can't come back. So it really reminded me, really hit home, because watched all of the Pirates of the Caribbean movies over the break, all 5. So it did do that. And then finally, my final tie is that in the Aeneid, it never mentions the inescapability of fate like the other works did. And Enkidu was bound by fate, and in the Descent of Inanna, it specifically says, that, sorry, I had it written down in my notes and told myself to get back. 1 second. So basically in the Descent of Inanna, it was like you can't escape. Yeah, page 78, it says your demons are coming for you, and that you can't escape your demons. And so this is more of a, like, he is destined to do stuff by the gods, but some of the actions that he does are a choice to please the gods or to not please the gods, instead of it's your fate is set in stone and that's where you go, like it was in Gilgamesh for Enkidu and in the Descent of Inanna for Inanna. The end.
Very good. Thank you for talking so much. Much appreciated. So does anybody have any other observations about the Aeneid or anything? Really don't So.
Kind of have a few observations, if I may. I want to come back to Dan H's about the respect of the sanctuary. Okay, so you talked about the Persians, right? The Persians going to the oracle of Apollo in Delphi, right? And you know they weren't able to take it. They were prevented from it by the heroes, Altonoos and Phulakos, who protected the shrine of Delphi. You remember the whole thing where the Delphians were trying to figure out, well, what are we going to do? And essentially Apollo says, I'll manage for myself, don't worry. You guys can go. And so they retreated up to a cave which is above Delphi. Today, you can hike up there. And then the Persians tried to come, and there was an earthquake, and a big rock from the face of the mountain comes down, and then they are terrified, and so Apollo protected his sanctuary from the Persians. And I just wanted to sort of underscore that there was, you know, the Persians, the one of the reasons why you remember the Persians came to invade Greece was because of what the Athenians had done for the temple in Sardis, right? And so there was that was a provocation of the war, was how one was to treat the sanctuaries or the churches of the other side, right? And in the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, there was this, you know, the Persians destroyed temples, the Greeks, the Athenians destroyed the temple in Sardis. There was a sense that it wasn't really intended that they destroyed the temple, but anyway, the point being is that in this conflict, the enemy forces view the destruction of the other side's religious sanctuaries and buildings as part of an act of war. As Professor Satterfield pointed out in her lecture, the Romans were different. Okay, the Romans wanted everybody's gods, right? They really were careful about desecrating any kind of anything that was of religious value to other people, and so they were very ecumenical. They were very open-minded about all of these gods because they thought the more gods are on their side, the better, right? And in fact, they would import gods that they found and so-called captured in foreign places and take them to Rome and establish shrines and temples to these gods because, you know, they wanted all of the gods on their side, right? Okay, so the Romans were a little bit different than the other nations. It's not to say that it didn't ever happen in active war, but the Romans were very interested in accumulating to themselves as much of the divine influence as they could possibly get. Okay, as Professor Satterfield noted, they were incredibly sort of superstitious people, and always seemed to be obsessed or seemed to be focused on the observances, religious observances. Let me say just a couple of things coming back to the things that you brought up. We have had, I mean, and I hope it was clear to you that we've got all kinds of visions of the afterlife, right? Everybody has a slightly different version, right? Enkidu has this dream about the afterlife. Thank you for looking up the so-called Nequia from the Odyssey, the trip of Odysseus to the edge of the world and to this very dim place where he makes what's called a bothros. He digs out a sort of a pit and pours offerings into it, makes offerings, and then the shades from the underworld come up and drink of the blood, and then they are able to speak to him. But there's also in there it's as though he enters in sort of maybe a dreamlike state, or he suddenly sees a vision into the afterlife and the Elysian fields, and people come and visit him. It's a very strange narrative, his encounter with the afterlife. We've seen, those of you who perhaps have read in Plato has another thing, another vision of the afterworld too, that is Pythagorean, and Aeneas, Virgil is drawing on these traditions. He's drawing on the literary tradition of, for example, Homer and the Trip to the Underworld, and he's drawing on the philosophical traditions of the Pythagoreans that come down to him from Plato, right? And he is merging these into his own vision of the afterlife that does involve this migration of souls, this reincarnation. That is not something that the Stoics believed in, right? But the Pythagoreans did, and so we have this whole system. So the question of, and Towns, you brought up the notion of there being some sort of, several of you mentioned this in the depictions of that there's some sort of judgment that takes place that is summative of a person's life, and that in some way it determines the kind of afterlife they will experience. Right? And we've seen several versions of that, and of course we're going to see another version of that when we get to the Jesus movement and to Muhammad's revelations as well. Very different things. And then of course Dante. Dante is going to take this trip to the underworld that Aeneas makes and refashion it along the lines of Christian theology. So we have, one is cyclical. Even the Stoics have this cyclical system. The Pythagoreans, it's cyclical. The Christians are going to have a teleological system, one that is headed towards some sort of end, right? And that was true of Gilgamesh as well, that there is this, and the Greeks, earlier Greeks in Homer, that there is, one goes through a life and then reaches some sort of immortal state in the afterlife, that this sort of goes on. There's not a cyclical thing. So the question is life linear and teleological, or is life cyclical? Right? These are the two big worlds, big world views that we're going to wrestle with. One of the big things about the difference, I've been mindful, Connor, keep me on track here. One of the issues about the Aeneid that makes it different than the Homeric poems is that it's retrospective, right? Aeneas, Virgil is looking back in time, back centuries in time, to explain and to account for why Rome is so significant at this point. And so he's able to move back and forth in time, right? More easily than we see it in the Homeric poems, right? The Homeric poems aren't retrospective, although they obviously were composed by singers that were looking back in time as well. But it wasn't about trying to explain the things, to a certain extent, why the things the way they are, but to tell the story, if you will. And this has a very different feel to it. It's more explanatory. It's more. There's a lot. It's easy to give prophecies of what's going to happen if one already knows what's going to happen, right? And we see that repeatedly in the Aeneid. And I thought Connor's point about the transparency of the oracles, of the utterances of the Sibyl, compared to the oracles of Apollo, is a very important one. This sort of reflects the Roman kind of a more straightforward, a less nuanced, if you will, approach to the world. Okay, that this is what's happening. This is what we need to do. Although in this there are these oracles that are a little bit hard to understand. It's not always transparent, because you remember they were trying to find their ancestral home, and they first went to Crete, and it turns out that wasn't their ancestral home after all. So there is some ambiguity, and there is built into the idea of the Sibyl, this notion where her pronouncements on these leaves can be reshuffled and can be confused, right? So it's not always clear. When you go to Cumae, and I hope you do go to Cumae, you will see that there is a temple of Apollo there. It's a big sanctuary of Apollo. It's the Roman instantiation of the worship of Apollo was slightly different than the Greeks, but the Romans built on the Greek system, and so you will see it was very, very similar. I mean, they have very similar things. Their settings are different, but the whole notion of this oracular seat and the sacredness of this seat, the unusualness of this area, as we saw up there, is striking. It's a very striking place, and you should go to it. The last point I want to make as we talk about the reverence for the dead, and the treatment of the body and all of that sort of thing. These are cross-cultural components. The way we treat the dead today is also has a certain sacredness to it. One of the things that the Romans are going to do as a consequence of their engagement with the kingdoms that emerged after the death of Alexander, the so-called successor kingdoms. One of the things that the Romans are going to do in adopting all of these religious traditions, right? The Romans loved it, okay? One of them that they're going to adopt is ruler cult. And this is something that the Greeks were very mindful of. This is in the wake of Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great goes to the oracle of Amun Zeus in Africa, and that's where the idea that he was descended of Zeus, that Zeus was his father by a mortal woman, Olympias. That this was, that he then viewed himself as semi-divine, right? Of divine parentage, at least on his father's side. I don't like to use semi-divine because it doesn't really work. But the notion that that rulers have some sort of divine aspect to them, and this is he takes this on, both blending the Greek religious idea with the Egyptian notion of the pharaohs, right? And what Alexander did is that when he conquered Egypt, he became pharaoh, right? When he conquered the Persians, he became the king of Persia, and he assumed all of the sort of trappings associated with those. As you heard in Professor Satterfield's lecture, the Romans went there too. Julius Caesar, Pompey, they all went into this area, and they all learned in this area certain aspects of certain religious conventions that they then imported to Rome. And so that idea that the Roman emperors ultimately become divine is something that they adopted from these societies that they subjugated in the East. And so you can see how it's layer upon layer of religious ideas that the Romans have incorporated, and we're not going to even see all of them. There are many, many other religious traditions that the Romans incorporate and that they import into their society. Of course, one of them is going to cause some problems, and that's going to be the Jesus movement. And we'll talk about why that was the one that caused problems. It wasn't the only one, but it was the major one. All right, so they're going to land